are here to talk about what it means to do business in a socially conscious way. Now, the phrase that we've all grown to loathe, corporate social responsibility, has thankfully, I think, been mostly retired from business discussions. But we did go through, we've been at it for a while now, thinking about business, the environment, social responsibility. What does leadership mean when it comes to thinking beyond the immediate bottom line? And both of you have, in your organizations and in your private and personal lives, put a lot of time in thinking about this. I want us to push beyond some of that tired debates of the CSR crowd to say, what's a fresh way of thinking about this? Maybe, Ira, I'll start with you. You have raised what must be one of the biggest funds for impact investing. Can you tell us what motivated you, and how did you persuade your investors to join you? And how much of this is just being a good guy, sort of a nudge, a nice guy who's sort of doing something philanthropic, maybe you can accept slightly subpar returns, versus have you made any harder promises to your money men and women?
Well, first of all, thanks, Vijay. Great to be here. Great to be at this event. I think it's the question itself, I think, highlights the changes that have evolved over time. Historically, this was an area that was thought about as concessionary. It was thought about that you made money by day and you divorced that from your philanthropic efforts at night. That's been the conventional 20th century view of this topic. And then it evolved.
Well, you can go back to the 19th century. Fair enough. Carnegie Hall, after all,
Carnegie,
right?
Here we go.
The great philanthropist.
Exactly right. Then it evolved in some ways to an exclusionary approach. It was all about what not to invest in. And what's changed over time, particularly where our firm plays, which is in backing early stage young startups, is this is a seminal moment in time where we now reject the notion of the or, and it's now about the and, where these things go together hand in hand, and it is absolutely not about the trade-off anymore. It's not about investors or ourselves as fund managers expecting any less return. It's about these things actually augmenting one another. And the driver for that, at least where we play, is really all about the entrepreneur. For a venture capitalist, the lifeblood of our business is the entrepreneur. And what's evolved over time is you see everyone ranging from the millennial generation to some of the most experienced executives who are serial entrepreneurs and finding where they want to make the next chapter of their personal professional lives, rejecting the notion of trade-off and wanting both to drive financial return as well as change the world in some fashion. And so you're just seeing this wave of entrepreneurship at the heart of impact investing, and there's an enormous amount of interest on the ground, which is what drives our fund's interest, and our investors do not expect any compromise in return. What they expect is this has gone from a time of albatross to a time of strategic differentiation as a fund manager, where entrepreneurs seek us out because of that mindset.
I want to press you on that because the idea that you can have your cake and eat it too sounds too good to be true. All right, so let me press back a little bit on your argument. Are there trade-offs? And if they're not, as you're positing, that is, you can in fact do good and do well. You have to tell me why. Is it because, for example, regulation or shifting government policies are creating opportunities for clean tech, for example? Or is it social mores? Expectations are changing. You have to give me more to go on to believe.
Yeah, so first of all, it's different for different sectors that are the underlying drivers in terms of sector opportunity. But at large, it comes down to, I think the last panelist Mark described it as the ant versus the elephant. And all these startups, in fact, are a David Goliath story. Under-resourced, trying to fight against incumbency. And one of the drivers behind passionate, mission-driven entrepreneurs is it's the exact opposite of mercenary. When one is missionary, it helps one drive through those very challenging times that inevitably arise as startups. And we can go through a litany of examples in our portfolio where, much like we just heard on the Netflix example, there were tough times, and it was that perseverance and tenacity that at the root of the entrepreneurial mission was not a mercenary story about just making money. It was all about how one was going to do some larger mission-driven thing. And I think that's, in the end, what differentiates a number of these underlying entrepreneurs that historically people thought were doing something good for the world, but in fact drives the financial success of these companies over time because of that ability to fight through. A number of examples in that. In fact, probably every successful company in the startup world you would ever hear about, we could talk about those early, difficult times. We don't talk about all the entrepreneurs that took the exit ramp when the going got tough, but we do talk about the successes. And most of them do have incredible number of stories of staring death in the face and fighting their way through. And when you have teams that actually have this broader mission-driven, purpose-driven approach, it is one of the drivers to fighting through those challenging times.
So we've gotten the perspective of an early stage investor from the entrepreneurial drive that you talk about that helps create this opportunity to have the win-win. Libby, let's turn to you. GE has been around more than 100 years, not quite the 175 years of The Economist. You're still young as a firm, but you've been around a bit. You're approaching middle age.
You aspire to.
Exactly. So it's not quite right to talk about your firm as an entrepreneurial young firm, but nevertheless, the initiative that you're involved with, Ecomagination, is only 12 years old. Can you tell us what is where do you pick up the story from where he's left off? What is it that GE is good at in this space? What do you do? Surely it's not seeding early stage companies or spotting the next Tesla or Google. What is it that you're good at, you think, in this space?
Well, thanks for the question and thanks for having us here. It's a great discussion and GE is really happy to be a part of it. Just building on what Ira said, I would say, first of all, marrying that impact up with the business case is really what drives scale. And that's what we think about, is bringing these technologies to scale. We also do invest in early stage businesses through our venture investments, and we also incubate businesses internally. And I think the unique thing that we can do with either ideas that we incubate internally or we source from externally is that scale that we can bring. And really, there's no better way to bring scale than to align it with market forces.
So, this is something, scaling. Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, often talks about now is the real challenge in Silicon Valley is scaling up. And so this sounds like a very important thing that GE, you have a good track record of doing this. I remember speaking with Jeff Immelt, the outgoing. Is he left the room yet?
He's been in the office, and
okay.
he just officially...
1 foot out the door.
Well, he officially transitioned the chairmanship over to John Flannery yesterday.
Yesterday, there we go. So literally this, just stepping out the door. Chairman, I spoke with him a few years ago, and he talked about how what GE is really good at is turning $25, $50 million businesses like the wind business, for example, that GE bought from Enron many years ago, and turning them into multi-billion-dollar businesses. And that very few companies can do that well. Yeah. In fact, lots of companies are great at buying in small companies and then killing innovation and finding that the founders leave and they're left with lots of write-offs that are quickly forgotten. And so GE has shown a talent time and again at finding these kinds of scalable winners. In Ecomagination, for those of us who are not following it that closely, can you tell us what is the mission of Ecomagination and how does it differ from what your locomotive business does or what your aerospace business does? What is it you hope to achieve?
Well, Ecomagination is our business strategy across the whole company for marrying up the financial case with impact on climate change, carbon emissions, and resource consumption. So it's really the premium products across our whole portfolio and our clean energy products, our renewable energy products that can drive that impact through products that can make a better business case for our customers and offer GE a growth opportunity. And it's been in place for around 12 years. We've invested $20 billion in cleaner energy and cleaner technology R&D, and the strategy has returned over $270 billion of revenue for the company in that time. So it's just a proof point that, I think to Ira's point, that this is where the world is going. It's where our customers want to go. It is the future. And we've seen that as proof through the growing traction of the Eco-Imagination portfolio at GE.
Ira?
Let me just give you an example. I mean, of course, our sectors that we focus on, like energy, like food and ag, and others, are mission-driven and fit the impact investing thesis as one aspect to how we invest. But let me give you another one in terms of how we attract entrepreneurs and strategically differentiate, and that's in the area of diversity. Unfortunately, and it's gotten a lot of attention, the venture asset class should not be proud of the lack of diversity that comprises startups today. And in our newest fund,
Or venture capitalists themselves, for that matter.
that's true. In fact, our firm is a big exception to that with my partner, Nancy Fund and Cynthia Ringo. Our firm itself, I think, is a great exception of that point. But in the startup world, some of the greatest companies right now are being led by women despite that fact. And in our newest fund, I think it's 7 or 8 of the first 12 companies are women-led. Now, that's not because we set out with a quota. It's not because we set out with any notion of compromise. It's because our culture has a mindset that has been able to attract some extraordinary entrepreneurs who happen to be women. It's just yet another example of this rejecting this notion of trade-off.
That's great.
And then our customers, too, are thinking about impact that they can have through their business. A lot of them are really focused on sustainability, and they're thinking about sustainability now as much broader than environmental sustainability. They're thinking about social impact, social sustainability, economic sustainability, not only for their own business, but for the greater economy. And so I think that's another trend that we're seeing too with our customers and the market in general, not just from business leaders and entrepreneurs, but from customers who want to make an impact through their business and through their products. And I mean, I would just say, if you're a company that wants to make impact, think about the big lever that you have. For GE, GE's equipment is responsible for about 1/3 of the energy produced around the world. That's a huge opportunity and a huge responsibility that GE has to make impact through our commercial products. So we reduce our carbon emissions internally, we reduce our fresh water consumption internally, but that's not enough, which is why we launched Eco-Imagination 12 years ago, to think about the big lever that we have, which is the performance of our products in the life cycle phase of their use. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to make positive impact through business if you think about the footprint that you have, the handprint that you have, and the big levers that you have, and can align that with market forces.
So, are you leading your customers down the green path?
In some cases, we do try to bring our customers along. We also try to prove.
Do they want to go? Are they reluctant sometimes?
In some cases, all it takes is proving with technology what's possible. And once we show them that it's a win-win, then again, the market forces kind of take care of that. And then we have some customers who are great, and they show us the way. They show us what they want to do, and then we're able to bring together what we kind of call the GE store, but it's really the enterprise value across the whole company, marrying up the best pieces, the most innovative pieces of our portfolio across all the businesses to innovate something new for our customers who truly want to do something new.
Vijay, I don't think it's that we're leading customers. I think right now, customers want to be embedded with some form of impact or environmental footprint. The historic barrier to it's not been the want. It's been the trade-off, typically around cost.
Yep.
It's in order to actually achieve some environmental or other social mission, what are we giving up in order to achieve that? That was historically the mindset.
Yeah.
And it's through these companies, these innovation that's unfolding, that's allowing us to reject that notion of trade-off. And in fact, as we've seen cost declines in the energy sector in certain areas, you see in many areas of the world, it is cheaper to be renewable than it is to be conventional and fossil.
Well, that gets to a bigger idea, and that is, for a long time, I've covered business for quite a long time for The Economist. I used to be our environment editor. I heard from companies like fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG companies, that we want to do more environmentally sustainable washing powder or whatever, but all of our testing says that people don't mind it, they might even want it, but they won't pay more.
Right.
And so they said the green stuff, we have to hide it inside, or we're not going to get a competitive advantage from it. Was it lack of ambition? You're involved, you're an early investor in Tesla, you're still very close to the company, and Elon Musk, he has shown a model of ambition in taking on some of these problems that some others haven't. Can you talk about the role of ambition in reframing the conversation and allowing that room for breakthrough innovation?
Yeah, it's not been lack of ambition. It's been lack historically of investors focusing on these sectors. What you saw historically was the venture asset class defined by information technology and life science. When we did our first energy investment, when the National Venture Capital Association described the percentage of dollars going into sectors, energy was embedded in the other category and represented less than 1% of all venture dollars. And what we've seen over time is a migration path from experienced entrepreneurs who were doing other things. You used the Elon example, someone doing PayPal 15 plus years ago,
right,
to today focusing on some of the world's biggest problems, including energy. And so it's the ambition of people who had big ambitions in other sectors is now impacting the energy sector. When you have that, it is about the innovation that leads to that lack of trade-off. And in some ways, Tesla was one good example of that. There are many, but it was the notion that in order to have an environmentally conscious car, it didn't have to look like a golf cart and go 30 miles. It was that you could actually have a great car and be environmentally conscious. And that's in fact what these innovation companies are doing. They are taking the notion of using technology, using breakthroughs, using financial business models to ultimately get to this point of lack of trade-off.
And building on that, I think we heard an element of that through your discussion with Mark in fundamentally thinking about an entertainment industry and a company within the entertainment industry as a software company. It's kind of turning that on its head. So thinking about bringing great, ambitious innovators from other technology companies into the energy sector, into the industrial sector, and turning that on its head. GE thinks about itself now as a digital industrial. So we think about ourselves as a software company, and that's enabling us to do fundamentally different things and move faster in a way that we would not be able to do with hardware alone. And I think that's the fundamental shift that we've seen in the industry over the years.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to tell the audience I'm going to come to you soon, so please get your questions ready. GE is undergoing, obviously, a revamp of its strategy, quite a significant refocusing on its industrial roots with the digital component at the leading edge. The financial bit has been mostly sold off, and we're seeing further asset disposals and so on. As it pivots, in a way, back to the future, to its roots as an industrial company, what does that mean for Eco-Imagination? And you're not only within Eco-Imagination, but you're in charge of innovation at Eco-Imagination. You're at the leading edge of the leading edge, as it were, at a time when the ship of state is changing radically in its direction. Tell us what it means for what your efforts are on the sustainability front.
Well, it means we have so many more tools at our disposal now. Just thinking about the digital piece, we have a couple of digital innovations that have grown now into products that allow us to introduce efficiency into existing hardware. So if we think about a digital wind farm, it's a software, it's an IoT-based kind of software routine that allows a wind farm to be optimized over the entire wind farm instead of just a single wind turbine. And so we can now see operating efficiencies that increase annual energy production of an existing wind farm from around 8% to around 20%. And so it's introducing a whole new degree of freedom that we didn't have before. And then layering in kind of data and analysis and potentially machine learning, AI, I think we'll be able to innovate even faster on how we do that optimization and how those routines run.
Make no mistake, this is about cost down in many of these sectors. I mean, we think we're at the infancy of energy innovation right now. What we've seen are sectors like solar have a cost decline of 150x from the late 70s to today, and that's led to massive deployment in ways we hadn't ever thought of before. Wind, the same. The LED example, I think, is one of the most phenomenal examples, and it actually centers around GE, the notion of the compact fluorescent bulb essentially being made obsolete by LED because of cost down, where you went from $30, $40 a lumen to a penny a lumen. Those are examples of the cost declines that we've just begun to see and lead to a radically different way of deploying energy. The other thing I'd quickly mention is when we think of energy sitting in this room with the lights above our head that we take for granted because we have a centralized grid that's actually been in place for the last century and it's being stressed, it's not only the innovations around grid management unfolding in companies like Advanced Microgrid Solutions that are figuring out ways to do optimization and load management, working with both utilities and the end customer here in the US, but it's also figuring out how we get light to the 1.5 billion today that don't have it, that are not grid connected.
And how to do that in a way that, that sets us on the right trajectory.
And that can be done in ways sensitive to cost. We have today examples of deployment in areas like Africa. We have a company, Off Grid Electric, that's finding ways to take costs down in storage and solar and do deployment in ways to create energy alternatives to kerosene. You know, once you actually do that, it unlocks a set of other applications once someone actually has access to that foundational energy footprint. And there's so many new things unfolding, both in the developed world and the developing world, as a result of these new innovations and cost down.
And it's, in some ways, again, back to the future. We're not so far from Pearl Street, where Edison had his first decentralized energy plant more than 100 years ago to power, in part, J.P. Morgan's house. He was a very clever guy, right? He knew where the money was. Yes, let's get a question here in the back. Let's get a microphone, please. Sir, sorry, the microphone's already there. I'll come to you second. I promise I'll get to you. Sir, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Munir Haq, and it's kind of surreal because I used to work for GE and now I run an impact fund just like Ira.
Please keep the microphone closer to your mouth.
Right, sure. So I'm not sure if you heard that. I used to work for GE and kind of run an impact fund, and I'm with Alliance Global.
We have an empty seat if you'd like to join.
Nowhere close to you guys.
Maybe it should be right between us.
So in some of our portfolio companies, a question, I guess, for both of you is that what kind of strategies do you use to, like in some cases when you have very passionate innovators and you love the technology, but you also know as an investor that there are other technologies around, and so this person who's very innovative is so into his technology that he's not aware that he could get taken out or she could get taken out. So what kind of strategies, have you ever faced that kind of problem? We've got this in two portfolio companies. That's why I'm trying to figure out how to grapple with this.
So you're asking about the competitive dynamics of being an early stage company?
Yes.
Essentially. I mean, that is at the core of essentially what we invest in at the early stage, is trying to find entrepreneurs who are out innovating and outpacing both other startups and incumbency. That ultimately defines whether or not a young company can ultimately get escape velocity with the competitive dynamic and framework around them. And it really comes down to, historically, there have been, at least in the sectors that we've been talking about, we just didn't have the kind of execution-oriented, experienced entrepreneurship partnered with domain experience like we had in other sectors, applied to energy, applied to areas like food and ag, applied to areas that are huge industries that historically have been both under-innovated and ignored by the venture community. And that's really what's changed. You have experienced entrepreneurs who actually know exactly how to do that, partnered often with domain experts in these fields, people who've been decades long, and partnered with new ideas and a new way of looking at the world to do that.
And I think from GE's perspective, and be interested in your thoughts on this too, but it seems like now not only are there more seasoned entrepreneurs that have learned the process of innovation, those practices have been distilled a little bit, and I think a growing class of innovators and entrepreneurs are taking it upon themselves to learn about a more effective and efficient way to innovate. Just as Mark kind of learned the hard way that the real innovation was learning how to test quickly, I think other innovators now kind of are almost schooled and are schooling themselves on those practices. So at GE, we've tried to make sure that our portfolio companies have exposure and access to all of that education and training. We bring our CEOs together for some sharing and best practice sharing. We expose them to our customers, to our businesses, so that they learn from the marketplace and are able to see what other innovative approaches and technologies they can pull in to their own strategies.
I'll give you one other quick data point, just and the optimist in me. And that is, if you want to actually feel good about where the innovation is heading and where some underlying entrepreneurship is happening, all you have to do today is actually go to universities around the globe. Where 20 years ago, the notion of having energy classes, energy clubs, and people coming out of universities saying, you know, I want my career to be in energy, it just wasn't happening in the same way. Today, you can go to almost any university, and it's a competition between and among all the schools as to where the energy ecosystem is going to lie. And you know, the number of applicants we get today compared to 10 years ago to our portfolio companies in these areas that we tended not to see before, that's where we actually as a group should be most optimistic.
So, and of course, we have on our stage someone who co-founded the Energy Club at MIT, our shared alma mater, so your point is well taken.
Yeah.
On the pages of The Economist, we have argued that we're actually living through a golden age of entrepreneurship, in part because some of the tools of entrepreneurship, access to capital, knowledge sharing, platforms, of course, obviously the living in an age of globalization and Googleization has enabled micro multinationals. It's a Cambrian explosion of entrepreneurship that's being made possible, and with nudges from the companies on stage being encouraged to go in socially responsible directions. So that's a hopeful note.
Vijay, I think
there's a
The
gentleman who's been
Economist-
very patient. So
I will say, I think The Economist is another example of combining the golden age of entrepreneurship with the golden age of impact investing. You now have a great event you do around this topic.
That's right.
20 years ago, didn't have that event.
we spot the trends early.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to, my name
please
is
identify
Charles
yourself.
Dhanaraj. I'm at Temple University, a professor in strategy.
Thank you.
One of the hard dilemmas is like sitting in Wall Street location here, talking about socially conscious business. In fact, P&G is under attack now, and Unilever was under attack. In terms of businesses that are trying to be socially conscious, investors are not able to take on the type of stress that it gets into the financial side. Even with GE, I mean, Jeff did a lot of stuff, but still was not valued for what he has done. So how do you put these two together? Is it we have to wait and see for another decade since the Wall Street will wake up, or where do we go with that?
Sure. A splash of cold water from our audience questioner. We recently profiled Paul Polman at Unilever, calling him St. Paul, and asking, you know, will St. Paul ultimately succeed? It's an open question, was what we concluded, but I'd love to hear what you two think about this broader question.
Well, I think it goes back to marrying up the benefit with the business case. And those two really have to go hand in hand to have a sound business and to really achieve the scale that will be transformative. If you're asking for whether it's investors or companies to do something purely just out of the goodness of their heart, you will find fewer who can support those activities than if you're truly offering a better product, a differentiated product, a better business case. So that's what we've really strived to do with the Ecomagination portfolio and with the whole Ecomagination strategy within GE. In terms of the investor community, I think we see a lot of investors having really high-level strategies for investing in sectors that are making beneficial improvements. And again, it's marrying up those opportunities with the business.
Ira, how do you
case.
answer this?
Ira's
Well,
a
I
great
think the question is exactly right, and I think it highlights why there's so many entrepreneurs who are actually tackling this problem, and that is, it's very hard to move a Titanic. It is very hard for the companies you reference that have very large market caps and have done business a certain way for decades and decades to suddenly turn on the dime. And that, in fact, is the opportunity for young startups who have a radically different thesis and have an integrated approach to how they're building their companies, their value, marrying value and values. And what you see are companies, I mean, Tesla is a good example of a company with an almost 60 billion market cap, and perhaps more importantly, its recent launch of the Model 3, it's the largest consumer product launch by dollar volume in history, eclipsing the former 3 largest product launches, which were all Apple products. I think it's a great example of young companies being able to tackle this emerging trend in ways that larger companies, incumbents, and historically business models that did not have this make it more challenging.
Another question from the floor. let's come here, please. Get a microphone.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Joel Selenicchio. I'm a doctor, and also I run a software company, and we've been working in technology and AI and health. But my question is about entrepreneurship, because like has been commented, we get this feeling we're living in this golden age of entrepreneurship. I think that phrase was even used. But it's been documented that for decades now, the number of new businesses started each year in the United States has been declining. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, it's definitely in the venture asset class where there have been an unprecedented amount of capital funding more companies. We actually have today, some would argue, perhaps too much capital in venture trying to target these companies. And I actually believe that when capital is scarce and when fewer companies are born, it actually, for entrepreneurs, is a better time to start a business. Entrepreneurship, by definition, is highly Darwinian, and when you have an overflow of capital funding perhaps too many ventures, competing for talent, competing for customers, it's been shown it's a harder time to actually build companies. So the traditional in me actually probably longs for the time when we have a bit less capital in the asset class, and we have less competition for the resources that the entrepreneurs are fighting for.
If I could answer your question as well, in addition to the venture capital, availability of capital generally, including crowdfunding and novel forms of funding that didn't exist in the past, I've actually written a story in the current issue of The Economist that takes on your question. Exactly. So from your kitchen table to your bedside, reading should be the right answer. But in a nutshell, you're absolutely right. If you look at aggregate rates of firm creation, we've been on a 25-year decline. It's a much trumpeted figure. Lots of people stand up and say there's a crisis in entrepreneurship, that we're not having enough entrepreneurial energy in America. Yes and no. If you were to tease out the data and look at quality of entrepreneurship, which people like the Kauffman Foundation and others do, experts at Sloan School, Brookings, others have looked at this, what you find is that so-called high-growth companies, gazelles they're called in the literature, are actually doing extraordinarily well. In fact, rebounding sharply since the Great Recession of a few years ago. And the latest data about to be published in a new report from Kauffman next week, which we cite in the report in The Economist, shows the trend is continuing very strongly. Now, what do these companies do that's different from the others? There's a difference. They signal an intent from the very beginning. If you call your shop Joe's Taco Stand, you're probably not aspiring to be the next Google or Facebook or GE, indeed, right? And so that very clever analysis shows that, for example, if you register your company in Delaware or have intellectual property at the foundation, there are little things that show your aspiration, but also we can look back after the fact and look at growth rates. So high growth entrepreneurship is doing exceedingly well, and it is not just high tech. It's across industries, and it's not just Silicon Valley. There are a lot of hotspots across America.
Actually, it's not just the U.S. I mean,
Yeah,
one of the things
around the
that's
world, of course,
exploding right now is global entrepreneurship.
Definitely.
And one of the things inhibiting entrepreneurship in the U.S. is policy. When we have to have, when it comes, immigration, a very important issue as it relates to the kind of entrepreneurship we need to have in this country, and there's been some policy issues around that are not helpful to the question you just asked. We need to have policy support in the U.S. It is a competitive barrier around countries that are actually seeking entrepreneurship and competing for the kinds of dollars that historically was defined much more as a U.S.-focused growth opportunity.
And a powerful threat is coming from Chinese entrepreneurs, including young generation of companies, not just the Alibabas and Tencents we're familiar with, but a whole wave of companies behind them in areas like AI and others that we'll soon hear more about. Another question? We have a little bit of time for perhaps one final wrap-up question. If not, I want to come back to the title of our panel, which is Business in the Wake of Socially Conscious Consumers. We talked about customers in your case, and of course entrepreneurs, but we didn't talk very much, if at all, about consumers. Can both of you briefly talk about whether we are in fact seeing more socially conscious consumers, as our panel title posits, And then, for example, in let's say the 60s and 70s, where the environmental movement, the second wave of the American environmental movement began, Rachel Carson, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. So there have been other eras of social consciousness. Yeah. So what's happening today and how is it related to the topic we're talking about? That is how business responds.
We do a lot of work. We're a B2B company, so that's why our focus is on customers. And then beyond our customers, we also do a lot of work to really understand what people at large are thinking about, what is important to them, and the trends that they're seeing. And some of the things that we've taken away is that one, environmentally conscious kind of values are really starting to become ingrained in people's expectations and their behaviors. Two is that a trend that I mentioned earlier is we're starting to see not only our customers, but consumers in general think more broadly about impact beyond environmental sustainability and think about sustainability beyond its environmental impact, thinking about social sustainability, the future of work, internal footprints, and just how a business operates in the world.
There's no doubt that we are at a time when the consumers care about this. I'll go back to what I said. It's not about whether consumers care about it, it's whether or not consumers can achieve that objective without this notion of trade-off. We're seeing it, I mentioned the Tesla example, but you look at so many other examples, Starbucks and Walmart doing fully transparent supply chains. And it's not because of some charitable notion, it's because that's what the consumers are demanding right now, is to be able to have a view into the fully integrated supply chain, understand where products are coming from, how they are made, what the sustainability footprint is. And as a result, that consumer demand is causing and catalyzing a whole new set of behaviors in businesses. I think there's another set of dynamics we've described, which are the millennial generation. You know, this is just core to how they approach what they are buying, how they're choosing among products. What they want to have is a set of products that they can achieve this notion of duality that we started the conversation with, where they can achieve all the things they want in the product, as well as serving some purpose-driven mission orientation. And DBL, what our firm stands for, is double bottom line, and it's actually to fund companies, fund products that actually can serve the consumer in that demand.